Hello and welcome, I'm Tom Proctor, and welcome to another episode of RAD TV at 5:25 on CCTV, Channel 17 in Chittenden County Centre for Media and Democracy and Town Meeting Television. RAD stands for Rights and Democracy. We are a grassroots, people-powered organisation committed to creating an independent political movement for long-lasting fundamental change in Vermont and New Hampshire. We bring you RAD TV on the fourth Friday of every month to provide an update on events and campaigns that Rights and Democracy are currently promoting. Tonight's show is called The Green Mountain Police State, and the topics being discussed this evening are the misconceptions of our criminal justice system in Vermont, a new idea about incarceration and rehabilitation, and police arrest data and management in Vermont. The guests I have this evening, I'd like to welcome back Mark Hughes. Really happy to have you back in today. Mark Hughes is the Executive Director for Justice for All. And Ashley Messier, VT Organizer for the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, and Executive Director of the Women's Justice and Freedom Initiative. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. So, just to give you a little bit of background for the viewers at home, Ashley, we'll start with you. Tell me a little bit about your organisation and how long you've been working with them.
Yeah, so I joined the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls January 1st. I was formerly with the ACLU of Vermont Smart Justice Campaign, working with them for the last couple of years prior to that. I also just very recently began a nonprofit here in Vermont, the Women's Justice and Freedom Initiative, or WJFI. And that idea was really born out of doing this work on a community, very grassroots level, a systemic level, and a policy legislative level, and really seeing the gaps for our community members, for women dealing with systems, whether it be corrections, the Department of Children and Families, employment, how we can better support Vermont communities and families here. And so we built a nonprofit to hopefully address those gaps and do the work in a way that's really committed to those most affected.
Fantastic. And Mark, could you give us a little bit of background on Justice for All?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you also for having me back. It's always good to be back on RAD TV. We started Justice for All. I started Justice for All in somewhere around late 2014. Just trying to figure stuff out with law enforcement at the time. If you remember 14, it was kind of a crazy summer. All of a sudden, it was possible to see people being killed by law enforcement, probably what felt to me like the first time in history. And that kind of evolved over time. So it's been about 5 years or so, largely focusing initially on law enforcement and just trying to research some of the what I would refer to as some of the preferred practices. At the time, if you remember, the administration that was in place had rolled out what they called the President's Final Report on 21st Century Policing. The holder folks were in place at the Justice Department. Loretta Lynch was in place. We were making a lot of progress in policing. That perspective or that approach, rather, as we were taking a look at policing, quickly expanded into the entire justice system. That's, prosecutors, the judges, the corrections system. We began to look at this entire thing from a systemic perspective and using words like systemic racism, and ultimately expanded even beyond that. So it led to some of the legislative work that we've done surrounding the Racial Disparities in the Criminal and Juvenile Justice System Advisory Panel, which is up and running now. It's been in place now for a couple of years under Act 54 in 2017. Yeah, we started to do some policy work along the way. And then also with Act 9, with the Racial Equity Executive Director, as well as the Racial Equity Panel was what happened in 18. So it's a lot of community outreach, education, policy advocacy, and so forth. So yeah, we're still doing that work. What happened is we kind of expanded, out just to create a policy apparatus called the Racial Justice Alliance, which is in and out of the State House. I guess that's a whole nother conversation. I don't know if that's good or bad, but in and out of the State House, and we're still moving policy, and I can tell you more about that legislative agenda as we move forward.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get into that this evening. I'd like to note this is a phone-in show, so audience, please feel free to give us a call, 802-862-3966, if you do want to speak to us live on air. Let's begin by talking about the misconceptions of our current criminal justice system in Vermont. So actually, I'll start with you. Please tell us what's going on in our prisons in Vermont.
Wow, such a large question. I think we can start with sort of a media-heavy content around the women's facility here in Vermont has been really highly profiled in the media. Sort of starting last year around the legislature allocating money to start looking at building a new women's facility, really sort of ramped up the community conversation and conversations with stakeholders and systems people around sort of the structure itself, who do we incarcerate for women there, what are the outcomes of after incarceration, whether it be reentry or community reintegration. And sort of during that conversation, we saw Paul Hines reporting in the 7 days at the end of last year around allegations of sexual misconduct, both against women who are incarcerated there and actually even staff, female staff had experienced those behaviors. And we held a large community event in response to that initial article of Paul's. And, the community was outraged, and many people, including a lot of stakeholders, were shocked and appalled at the allegations, at things that Paul had investigated and uncovered throughout that work. And those of us who have been incarcerated in the system here were not shocked and appalled. Unfortunately, we were, I guess the word would be sort of like, we've been screaming this for decades. Women have been screaming these allegations from the facilities in Vermont for just many years, and they went unheard and unaddressed. And so, happy that the public is now more aware of sort of what's really going on inside. I think that we are still waiting to see a real response from corrections. The women currently still do not have a safe outside reporting line for accusations of sexual misconduct. I think that it's also brought to light many of these abuses happening in the male facilities. They hired Jim Baker as the interim commissioner of corrections, and I know that he's sort of beginning to look into some of these sides, but I feel like more of a focus has been put sort of on the employment side versus the women and men living in Vermont facilities in our state. And so I think that we've sort of come to a crossroads where people agree that CRCF needs to be closed. And I think that corrections, some of our legislature would say, we need to build a new facility. And those of us who have lived in those facilities and have done this work for many years know that something else is possible. And so, at the National Council, we believe in ending the incarceration of women and girls as we know it, very unapologetically. And if we have the money to build a new prison in Vermont, then we have the money to spend on alternatives. I believe if we're going to spend taxpayers' money, that the people of Vermont deserve and absolutely are entitled to have the safest, most flourishing communities that we can give them, and alternatives and addressing the reasons that people become criminally, legally involved is really the solution to provide that for everyday Vermonters.
Mm-hmm. And so you were saying that you weren't surprised at all when these allegations came out. Is this happening across the country and it's just a matter of one reporter needs to go in and open this wide open? Or is this unique to Vermont where this kind of abuse is happening?
It's absolutely not unique to Vermont. I do this work, obviously, very hyper-local in Vermont and then on a national context. And of course, this is not unique to Vermont. Unfortunately, the entire sort of prison industrial complex very much started out as a way to replicate slavery. It is inherently toxic, punitive, dehumanizing. And so any system that is born out of that ideology is going to continue that way and even affect its staff, right? So you could even take well-intentioned people, which I think we have many here in Vermont that work in our prison systems and in our correction system, and a toxic system will affect your employees as well. And so, I think early on they realized that the prison industrial complex worked so well to disenfranchise, dismantle, and segregate Black and brown people in this country that they said, we're going to open it up to anybody that we don't want to deal with, anybody that we view as morally corrupt, because it's worked so well for us to disenfranchise Black and brown people. And it's horrifying the way that we've allowed these systems in the year of 2020 to dismantle our communities, our families, our economic structure, and the power of the people in this country and in Vermont.
Mm-hmm. And Mark, when it comes to Vermonters imprisoned, why are so many imprisoned out of state? And would you agree with Ashley's interpretation of why there's so much abuse in the prison system, or is there anything else that you'd like to add to that?
Well, first, I just want to just hold Ashley up. I mean, Ashley and I are friends, and I've been knowing you for a while, and it's just good to see you again and hear about all of the exciting things that you're doing. I really appreciate that and the work that you do. And I just want to support that line of reasoning when we talk about the prison industrial complex and its origins and talk about the intersection of how that impacts not just our community but our society, and who we are as a nation, and just remind us all that even in 1865 that we never abolished slavery in this country. We only just created a loophole for it, and we created it in this amendment that we call 13. And in that, what we decided is how we would categorize people that we would incarcerate. Then we decided who we would incarcerate, and that continues to this day. So whether it's the criminalization of blackness or whether it's poverty or anything else that someone who's white male cis power doesn't like, then that's what we're looking at. And unfortunately, what we're seeing as a result of what we're seeing in the prison here that Ashley was just talking about is a unfortunate, and this is a horrible way to say it, but it is I think an appropriate way to contextualize it, is a collateral damage that's being that's occurring as a result of the incarceration that we have of women in our communities. And there's a much broader conversation to be had, not just about the way that we treat people that we choose to incarcerate, because we do indeed consider them as slaves. They are constitutionally, by the United States Constitution, we as a society have always considered the people who we incarcerate, that we choose to incarcerate, as slaves. That's the reason why they're treated the way that they're treated. They're housed the way they're housed. They're fed the way they're fed. They're paid the way they're paid, if they're paid, and so on and so forth. And so we got to really rethink as a nation a lot of this. And I think that that even goes into how we view their disposition. Are we just throwing the baby out with the bathwater? No pun intended. Are we really trying to, those folks who actually need to be in prison, and there are some people who need to be in prison, okay? But are we really trying to rehabilitate them, to restore them and replace them into their proper positioning in their communities? Those are the questions that we should be asking ourselves. Now, as it pertains to, as Ashley talked about, the history of, from convict leasing and forward through the war on drugs, and the reason why we have 2.3 million people incarcerated nationally, with upwards of 1 million who are black folks incarcerated, is because of the way in which we've built this thing, not to mention the other 6 million people that are under the control of corrections across the United States, or the other 16 million that are in some way or another have a capital F after their name. So we've got, and what that does is obviously relegates you to a permanent second-class citizen as a result of carrying that felony charge, okay? But as we begin to look at, the impact, we start to look at, how it manifests itself here in Vermont, and how we're dealing with it. This is just, a symptom of a larger problem, if you will. This, as we struggle with 250 people down in a Mississippi prison, as we struggle with, as we have a population of 1.4% blacks, but our prison population is at about 11% black folks. These are all symptoms of larger problems. And I think, yes, we in Vermont, we do have some more severe implications, some more severe challenges, and we can evidence that by some of the data that we're getting from think tanks like the folks at the Sentencing Project, the DC think tank, who has gone in and done extensive research in these areas.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the symptoms? So you say, you know, this is the fact that we've got such a high incarceration rate for black folk in comparison to the level of how many black people we have in Vermont. Where does this come from? Where's the systemic racism kind of emerging from, and how do we get rid of that?
That's interesting because I think that we have to. One of the things that if you go into meetings, and Ashley, you've been in so many meetings. I mean, it's almost like I was going to start a company called M&T, meet and talk. Yep. But you go into some of these meetings, you would think that, if you look at the premise and if you look at the context and even much of the content of the meeting, you'd think that we were not in a racist nation. Or at least you'd think that there are many people sitting around the table who didn't understand that. The truth is we are in a racist nation. We are the same nation that from before we were a nation, when the first black foot stepped on then colonial soil in 1619, they were enslaved. When the Constitution was written, we were not people. And it wasn't until 1865, 1866, where that other amendment, we call 14, gave people like me the categorization of human or citizen or person. So we also have to remember that when our Constitution was written, that we were not classified as people, right? So we have to understand that is the fabric of who we are. Our laws, they the constructs of our laws were as such that the framework of our nation in terms of our Constitution, our statutes, our rules, our constructs, all of them have always really fed into this, and I guess what I'm getting at, if you think about even not just the legislature, but also even the Supreme Court. I mean, hell, just last week, the Supreme Court said it was constitutional for a border guard to shoot across the border into Mexico and kill a Mexican, and that's okay. That's not okay. Okay, and whether it's Dred Scott or whether it's Plessy Ferguson, there's always been this history that, with a very, very small exception of our Supreme Court, that's always ruled, in a very white, classist, and a very discriminatory manner towards people of color. So I think that's what we have to frame when we look at the criminal justice system, just like when we look at housing. Just like when we look at education, just like when we look at employment. The unemployment rate in this nation for black people has always, throughout all history, been twice that of white people. So this is all constructed. So when we look at the criminal justice system, as it pertains at least to this systemic racist component of it, we have to remember that it is part of something that's larger than itself. So when I say symptoms, I'm talking about this is just another manifestation of who we've always been as a nation.
And I think I'd just like to add to what Mark is saying by also saying that to give an example of how those symptoms play out in Vermont very specifically is that when we go into communities and start having conversations about systemic racism and the fact that it's alive and well, unfortunately, here in Vermont, we're met with a lot of defensiveness from Vermont communities. And so I've heard comments like, well, it's those people from that city bringing drugs here, right? Meaning black men coming from places like New York City, Philadelphia, et cetera, bringing drugs to our pristine white state. Right. And I always have to push back and say, well, first of all, that's not accurate. That's not our entire population of incarcerated black and brown men. And second of all, I am very white, as you can tell, and I sold heroin in this state. And I drove to those cities, introduced myself to those people, offered offered to house them, feed them, and introduce them to my friends. So there's this sort of interesting dynamic that then changes the conversation around, Vermonters believe that racial disparity in our criminal justice system is sort of from these other people from other places coming, invading, so to speak, our nice white state. And it's an interesting conversation, and I think that Vermonters really need to grapple with some fundamental conversations around race, around how we respond to harm, because we can sort of address policy, we can address systems, we can be in 1,000 meetings, but until me and you and Tom Smith down the road that pays his taxes really start grappling with how we respond to harm, how we respond to race relations, we're not really going to actually be able to gain the ground that we really want to see gained here in Vermont. I think we could be a real leader in these conversations because Vermonters really believe in relationship and really believe in sort of that neighborly looking out for each other in our communities. Right. And so I look forward to having those conversations.
I want to go back to the conversation on harm, and the discussion is incredibly rich, so I'm going to have to move past some of what you just said, because there are no data that support this assertion that there are black and brown folks that are bringing drugs. In fact, if you look at the numbers, it says the opposite. It says something very, very, very different.
Exactly.
But I want to go back to harm, though, just really briefly, because I know our time is limited. And it's just an observation that I've made over just the last 5 years that I've been doing the work is that there are so many people in the justice system. I have direct, relationships with people in my own family, very personal relationships, and they come from places of harm. And there's harm, when you look at addiction, for example, and you look at if you look at just this concept of trauma and what it means and what it causes people to do if left untreated, and the impact that has not just on the individual's lives but also in the things that they do, but also the concentric circles that go around them and the other social issues and challenges that and legal as a result challenges that result. Sometimes I ask myself, are we really focusing on the right crimes?
Right.
When you start looking at, domestic violence, when you start looking at, sexual assault and children being molested, when you start looking at the Cub Scouts, you start looking at, the church and the things that are happening in that respect. Who are real criminals and what harm are they causing that is perpetuating what it is that's being that we're seeing manifest itself, and it's playing itself out in drugs and so on and so forth. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, it's people committing crimes as a symptom of what's going on larger in society. The fact that we've got such massive income inequality, the fact that we see on a daily basis these days, the Trump administration and every administration before that, by the way, who have just been better at covering up their crimes, committing fraud and embezzlement on a gigantic scale and depriving communities of the resources they need in order to flourish. And then what I'm gathering is the kind of eventual outcome of that is humans feeling at their wits' end and either lashing out or doing what they can in order to numb the pain and the neglect that they feel. And then we punish that neglect, or we punish those actions rather than the actions.
Or we go looking for somebody with drugs.
Right, or we go looking for someone with drugs. We've not got too long, so I'm going to have to keep these last couple of questions brief. But actually, you were talking before about wanting to end the prison system in Vermont for women and girls. Could you give me a vision of what that looks like? What would be your utopian vision for the end of incarceration in Vermont?
Yeah, so initially I will say my utopian vision for ending the incarceration of women and girls in Vermont really looks like reimagining communities, right? It looks like a Vermont where our more urban, Burlington, Chittenden, Franklin County areas and our rural communities are flourishing, where people are really having the underlying reasons of addiction, mental health, incarceration met, so that we can sort of avoid some of that systems involvement. And what that really looks like is I'll take my own story, for example. Being someone who was a heroin addict, who suffered incredible trauma through being a victim of domestic sexual violence and human trafficking throughout my life, and then sort of used drugs to survive, honestly, and then committed crimes to support my drug habit in an effort to survive. And my story is like so many other women right now who we incarcerate, and I'm going to stay really Vermont specific right now. We know that upwards of more than 80% of our population at CRCF right now are, victims of trauma in many different shapes and forms, struggle with mental health, struggle with addiction, are primary parents to minor children. And so really, if we're talking about who we incarcerate and why, and what the harm really is, the belief is that we can build alternatives to incarceration. I am not saying that these women and girls do not need support, that we do not need to come together as a community, as stakeholders, as state government, and support people, right? Because we've got a lot of harm to address on both ends of the spectrum. And so what we're saying, though, is a smart investment. If we're going to spend taxpayers' money, let's give them the biggest bang for their buck, so to speak. It sounds naive, but the reality is that actually for less money than we're paying to incarcerate a woman for a year, we could pay to have basic needs met. We could pay to have her get treatment. We could keep her with her children, all of the things that will help these women and girls address how they ended up involved with the legal system, right? That's the real key. Rehabilitation is about being able to address, right, the underlying cause of your behavior. And we are not providing that exponentially for the women. We're also not providing it for the men. And, every reform measure that I support or talk about will exponentially benefit the men as well. I don't ever want to appear that I don't care about the male population or aren't just as concerned. My husband is formerly incarcerated in every Vermont facility and 2 of our out-of-state facilities he was in. And so this is incredibly personal as well for me in my family. But that's the reality, is that we can build alternatives. We can close the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility, and we do not need to build a new women's prison. There have been decades of studies now. We have everyone from architects being a part of this conversation to stakeholders willing to hold this work. I mean, if we stopped level funding mental health and addiction services, the conversation would be very different. So, these plans don't require more money from taxpayers. They require a reappropriations from the Department of Corrections to the community level and community services.
Well, that is all we've got time for. But Ashley, Mark, thank you so much for you both
for having us.
Yes,
coming
thank you.
on. And I'd love to get you back on in the future so we can discuss, this a little bit more. I feel like we kind of run out of time today. So
Glad to come back.
Thank you so much for watching our show. We really do hope you join us next month right here at on the 4th Friday at 5:25. Shout out to our sustaining members who assist in funding the grassroots campaign. And we really would urge you to become a sustaining member. You can do that at radvt.org or radnh.org. More often than not, these are very local campaigns that focus on one municipality when we do launch a campaign. So when you do become a sustaining member, you really are looking out and helping your own local community. And that's where grassroots change starts. Please become a sustaining member today by visiting our website or going to our Facebook page. Thank you once again to Ashley and Mark for coming on the show this evening. I've been your host, Tom Proctor, and good night.